this week's episode of the Rise to Reign podcast. And this podcast is all about our core wounding and the belief system that we form around that. So, by now, hopefully, you've heard me talk a lot about emotional patterning. And we know that a pattern is sort of like a encoding in your nervous system that you play out unconsciously in response to a certain stimuli. So, another way of saying that is like a pattern is a mental stronghold. So when you're growing up, you come out of the womb, in Freud's language is like tabula rasa, which is like a blank slate. That's psychological terms for just like a blank slate. We know now that there's so much more. There's a lot of trauma that can be encoded in utero, as well as generational patterns and traumas that we carry through our bloodline and our DNA, cellularly as well as spiritually and emotionally. So, patterns are sort of the software that your computer is running. And it's like an input output. So, a stimuli happens and it triggers a pattern, and it's sort of your personality or the way that you show up or your style of relating. Really, what it is kind of survival mode. So a pattern is a way that you learned to be in the world to avoid pain or to gain pleasure, but mostly to avoid the pain of rejection. So another way of saying it is that this is from the Bible, is that patterns are mental strongholds. So they're like neural networks of a tangled mess of trauma and experiences and beliefs that have been passed down and like sort of programmed into you. So our work when in Rise to Reign, when we're looking at patterns and trying to begin to heal and unwind these things, is to look at the data and not the drama. So that is to sort of set the emotions aside for a moment and look at the science of the brain and apply logic to a situation is really, really helpful to gain self-awareness around your patterns. It's basically the process of just becoming an observer. It's really powerful to become the observer of your thoughts so you can kind of see what's going on inside your head rather than experiencing what's going on in your head. It's like the difference of like walking around on a street in a city and going up in a helicopter where you can see the whole city and all the streets. When you're down on the street, all you can see is the one that you're on, and you're in it. And when you come up to sort of like the bird's eye view with logic and observation, it's called coming conscious, you can see what's going on, what the patterns are. So when we extract the data without the drama, we can see like, oh, I lose my mind when people don't listen to me or when I'm ignored. And we can start to follow those threads back to our core wounding. So let's observe the pattern instead of letting our brain get us lost in the story, okay? Because the story is really easy to believe because you've been telling it to yourself your whole life. So we become conscious of our patterns when we sort of step back and observe ourselves in the way that we react and respond in certain situations. We can easily see how our chaotic and dysfunctional behaviors fit together, and we can identify a common theme and again trace it back to what would be like the core or primary wounding. So there's something called Occam's Razor, and basically that states that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity, or the easier way to say that is that the simplest explanations are usually the most accurate. So my doctor used to say, like in diagnosing illness as a doctor, he would say if you hear hoofbeats, like you don't look for a zebra, right? Because it's probably going to be a horse, because that's the simplest explanation and it's not multiplied beyond necessity. So we don't need to overcomplicate this. We just need to ask the question, what do all of my behaviors sort of have in common? What's the common theme? What's the through line in my behaviors and in the patterns? I promise there is one. So by now, if you've been listening to at least season 2 of the podcast, we're on episode 24 now. You're most assuredly seeing patterns hopefully begin to emerge into your awareness. So today we're going to get really clear on what they are so that we can actually begin to rewire them. Next week's episode, I'm going to cover today. Last week, I covered like sort of a primer on trauma. This week, I'm talking about patterns and core wounding. And next week, I'm going to talk about how to actually begin to rewire those emotional responses. So remember that your brain's main job is to keep you safe. And by safe, what your brain's main job is, according to itself, is to keep you alive. So it perceives anything unfamiliar as a threat. This is where we get the concept of our comfort zone. Our comfort zone is just basically like our zone of familiarity, where we feel safe, where we feel comfortable, where there's nothing unfamiliar. So anytime you try to change, like shift out of a pattern or try something new or expand or grow, your brain clicks on a protective mechanism that will try and sabotage that. And so there's a way around it, but I want you to just be aware of that. It comes in usually in the forms of all kinds of like scary stories and programming about all the awful things that are going to happen. That's basically brain science. So let's talk about how a pattern's formed. A pattern is laid down over many, many years of interactions, and it looks like this. So number one, you experience a negatively perceived event. That's trauma. We covered that in the last episode. The second thing is you receive a wound from that. The wounding occurs. So you feel a highly charged emotional sense of pain. So something happens, a trauma happens, you feel that, and that's the human emotion. There's absolutely nothing. The human experience is emotion. So you feel a highly charged emotional state of pain. That's the wounding. And then here's where we get in trouble. Your brain, with sometimes some outside adversarial assistance whispering to you, tries to make sense of the event. Okay, it gives it a meaning. We are meaning making machines. So our brains will, we had a trauma, we experienced a wound, an emotional wound, and now our brain's going to go, well, here's what this means, and here's how to avoid it in the future. So there's the story that shows up. Okay, so let's say that our dad was really mean and angry, and then we grew up and we began to date a boy, and he was really mean and angry too, and that hurt, and those interactions hurt us. And so our brain says, oh, I know what this means. Men are jerks. And then you begin to form a belief system around that by agreeing with that suggestion that your brain offers you, or sometimes, something maybe negative, evil, adversarial outside your brain is whispering to you. And so when you agree with it, that's when you give it your agency. That's when you give it your power. That's when you give it your sovereignty. So you can go back and listen to the episodes on sovereignty. But sovereignty is basically your authority to govern yourself and to choose and to be a self-contained individual. So when you join your agreement with a suggestion, whether it comes from your own brain, whether it comes from your parents, or whether it comes from the realm of darkness, you give your power to it. You give your power away to that belief and that meaning. So then, step number 5, your brain uses this belief to order your thoughts and behaviors. Okay, so if I believe that men are jerks, I'm going to stay away from them. I'm going to be mean back to them. I'm going to play maybe some power games with them to try to get the upper hand. So the trauma happens, then the wound, create a meaning, belief, you agree with the meaning, and then your brain uses the belief to organize your thoughts and behaviors, and that becomes a pattern. Okay, so there are 4 main categories of core wounding. The first one is rejection. And rejection says, I'm not worthy of love. So the fear, so the wound is rejection. So the traumatic event is experienced as rejection. And remember, patterning is based on perception. So however you perceived it, there's an example here that I tell a lot in my Rise to Reign course and with my coaching clients, of a time, like my earliest memory was walking down the hall into my parents' bedroom, And my mom and dad and sister were all in the bed, like tickle fighting and, laughing and watching cartoons. It was a Saturday morning. And I felt so on the outside looking in. And when my dad noticed me walking up, he said, "Oh, here comes Sister Trouble." And I don't for a second believe that my dad meant that insulting or rejecting. I don't for a second think that my sister and my mom and dad had malicious intent, but I experienced it as extreme rejection in that heightened emotional state. So patterning is based on perception, which is your subjective reality, what you experience versus what is maybe objectively true. And so that rejection is the wound. So the traumatic experience is walking into the room and experiencing that scene. The rejection is the emotional charge that was felt, and then the meaning is I'm not I don't belong. I'm not worthy of love. That's the rejection pattern. And so the pattern is fearing and resisting receiving feedback, direction, or love from others. Okay, so maybe as I go through these, you'll begin to kind of see them and how they play out in your own life. This in the Rise to Reign archetypes is the prisoner and or slave archetype. Okay, the second one is abandonment. And this abandonment is the wound, and the belief that goes with it is I'm not worthy of belonging. Okay, so the abandonment core wound is highly mistrustful of others in combination with a high degree, like a toxic degree of self-reliance. They will not let anybody come through for them. They won't rely on anybody. They sabotage all efforts of support because they don't believe they're worthy of belonging and the support that comes along with community. So this is very typical of the prisoner and slave, of course, but also the prince and princess. The toxic self-reliant is like behaving like an orphan is the hallmark of the prince and princess. Is like, I don't need anybody. I can do it all on my own. The third one is the trauma is failure. So the wound is experienced as failure. The trauma is an event. The wound is experienced as failure. And the belief is I'm not worthy of success. So here we see a repeated pattern of letting others down and self-sabotage, especially those whom they desire the most approval from. So this is very characteristic of the prisoner and the slave. And then there is a fourth, but this is kind of like just basically like giving up on life. The person with the primary wound of resignation is what we'll call it. Believes that life has no meaning, and they usually are suicidal, highly addicted, and it's not really kind of the focus of our work right here because it's far less common. Most of us whose lives aren't completely train wrecked by extreme trauma are dealing in some combination or category, but of abandonment, rejection, or failure, core wounding. And usually it's a cocktail of all three, but there's one that will stand out predominantly. All right, so that, my friends, is how patterns are formed and how they are laid down in your central nervous system. And they're problematic because they're not true. Like the I'm not worthy of love, belonging, or success are total lies. None of that's true. But if you have that running in the background, if that's the software that you're running, remember your brain organizes your behaviors around that belief. And so obviously that's problematic because you will create, as a powerful co-creator, you will create situations and it'll become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And my guess is you probably experience that. Next week, we're going to get into actually how to begin rewiring these. So thank you so much for listening. That's it for this episode of the Rise to Reign podcast. I will see you in the next one.